I was searching through a digitized archive of Russian engineering journals from the early 1840s, not looking for anything in particular, just following the thread of a pre-Crimean War infrastructure project, when I found a diagram I was not supposed to find. It was a cross-section of a public building in Kazan, dated 1843. The architect, a man named Petrov, had annotated the copper spire assembly not with the expected language of religious symbolism or lightning dissipation, but with a strange, clinical phrase, atmospheric potential collector. That stopped me cold. Because Petrov's diagram didn't show a simple grounding cable terminating in the earth, the standard Franklin configuration. It showed the metal spine descending into a network of zinc-lined ducts and iron tension rods woven through the building's core, terminating in porcelain isolators above a basement chamber that contained nothing but a series of large, slate-encased jars. No wires, no connection to any machinery Petrov documented, just the collector, the conduit, and a storage medium. The journal offered no further explanation. No operational theory, no acknowledgement that this assembly was anything other than a standard architectural feature. But it wasn't standard, and I have since found variations of it in building plans from Warsaw to Vladivostok. Whatever these structures were designed to collect, it wasn't lightning, and whatever they were powering was never recorded. The more I traced this architectural logic across the territories of what we now call Tartaria, the more I became convinced that by the time Petrov put ink to paper, the system he was documenting was already in the process of being erased. The question is, erased by whom and why? The official history of Tartaria is that it was never a civilization at all. It was a cartographic convenience, a blanket term used by European mapmakers to describe the vast, unmapped interior of Eurasia, a place of nomadic tribes and scattered khanates with no unifying culture and certainly no advanced technology. This explanation is tidy, dismissive, and almost universally accepted, but it collapses on contact with the physical evidence. If Tartaria was merely a label for a disorganized frontier, why do the ruins from Poland to the Pacific share a recurring technological fingerprint that required centralized industrial coordination? The Petrov diagram is not an outlier. I have now located 11 separate engineering cross-sections from the 1830s through the early 1850s, sourced from municipal archives in Omsk, Perm, and Tomsk, that depict variations of the same system. A copper alloy atmospheric collector, an internal metal lattice, and a basement storage array isolated on porcelain or slate blocks. The components are dimensionally consistent, as if fabricated to a lost standard. And in every case, the accompanying documentation describes these assemblies with the same matter-of-fact language one would use for a staircase or a flue. They were not considered remarkable enough to explain. This raises a question that quietly unravels the official narrative. If this technology was standard enough to be unremarkable, how many thousands of buildings across the Tartarian sphere were equipped with it? And if it was so ubiquitous, why is its existence not merely forgotten, but actively absent from every textbook on the history of energy? The absence is not natural. It is architectural, deliberate, and it bears the fingerprints of a coordinated erasure that began in earnest after the sky turned red in September of 1859. I keep returning to the slate-encased jars in Petrov's basement chamber. To a modern engineer, they are an enigma, a storage medium with no documented electrical output. To a 19th-century industrialist, they would have been something far more dangerous. Proof that energy could be harvested without combustion and without cost. I wonder what other diagrams are still waiting in unindexed folders, dismissed as decorative sketches because we lack the vocabulary to describe what they truly represent. The question Petrov's diagram raises is not merely whether such a system existed, but how it functioned without a combustion source. Every officially sanctioned energy technology of the era, steam, coal gas, early voltaic piles, left behind a chemical signature, a residue of ash or exhausted acid. Yet the basement chambers shown in these cross-sections contain no flues, no fuel stores, no evidence of chemical reaction. Just the jars, the porcelain isolators, and a deliberate, engineered connection to the Earth. A growing body of geophysical survey data, published quietly in Eastern European engineering journals that rarely see translation, has mapped telluric current anomalies directly beneath the footprints of demolished Tartarian civic halls. These subsurface corridors of elevated conductivity are not natural mineral veins. They follow the exact grid geometry of the building's iron frameworks, terminating at depth in water-bearing strata, a configuration that any modern electrical engineer would recognize as a grounding array designed for low-frequency resonance. The system, in essence, was tuned like an antenna, not to transmit signals, but to harvest the ambient potential gradient that exists between the ionosphere and the planet's surface. The concept is not mystical. It is a variant of what Nikola Tesla would later pursue at Wardenclyffe, a wireless harvesting of atmospheric electricity. But Tesla was building a prototype in 1901, in a world that had already forgotten its predecessors. The Tartarian network appears to have been operational, refined, and geographically distributed half a century earlier, a fact that makes the events of September 1st and 2nd, 1859, not a mere solar curiosity, but the most plausible mechanism of its destruction. A coronal mass ejection of the magnitude Carrington witnessed would have induced a geomagnetic storm powerful enough to overload any long conductor system tuned to the Earth's natural frequencies. The silent death of the slate-encased jars would have been instantaneous. Dielectric breakdown, a crystallization failure of the internal matrix, leaving no fire, no visible wreckage, only inert components that no longer held a charge. And in the months that followed, a curious pattern emerges in municipal records across 3 continents. Suddenly, commissions are formed to assess the structural safety of public building spires. Contracts are let for the removal of decorative metalwork that had stood for decades. Architectural journals pivot abruptly from illustrated guides on finial geometry to new, plainer, lower-roofed designs. The justification is always modernization, never function. The copper removed from thousands of rooftops enters the global market at precisely the moment telegraph and electrical grid demand explodes. It is an elegant, silent recycling, the physical evidence of a free energy infrastructure literally melted down into the wires of the metered age it was replaced by. I keep coming back to the slate jar in that Tomsk museum, labeled as a ritual vessel, its surface crazed with fractures that speak of a single, catastrophic overvoltage event. The label is a safe answer. The ceramic tells a different story, if you know how to read it. The dismantling was planetary. The identical spire geometry, a copper alloy finial atop an internal metal lattice terminating in a basement array, appears in the oldest photographs of civic buildings, from Cincinnati to Lima to Melbourne. In every case, the metalwork was quietly removed in the late 1860s, the contracts always worded as modernization. The recovered copper, thousands of tons of it, flooded the London Metal Exchange at precisely the moment the demand for telegraph wire and electric power cables began its exponential climb. The old infrastructure was literally recycled into the new, a material transmutation that converted a free public energy grid into a private, metered network without a single law being passed. The economic logic is brutal in its simplicity. Atmospheric potential energy, harvested directly from the differential between ground and sky, is unminable, unburnable, and uninvoiceable. It cannot be stockpiled by a trust or sold by the kilowatt hour. For the coal syndicates and gas companies consolidating into monopolies in the 1860s, the architectural grid was not obsolete. It was an existential threat. The Carrington event, whatever its celestial origin, conveniently disabled that threat at the exact historical moment the industrial fuel economy was strong enough to replace it. No conspiracy meeting was required. The incentive to bury the evidence was structurally embedded in the new economic order. What followed was a coordinated bureaucratic disappearance, executed not by secret police, but by zoning boards, architectural schools, and museum registrars. Municipal payrolls in the 1870s show that the position of atmospheric apparatus keeper, a title I have now found in over 20 city archives from the 1840s, simply vanishes. It is not eliminated, it is not replaced by a new title. The line item is deleted. The slate jars, many of which survived the solar surge with characteristic internal fracturing, were donated to local antiquarian societies with a note: ritual object, origin unknown. The architectural treatises that had, as late as 1855, contained illustrated chapters on spire tuning and telluric grounding were reissued in revised editions from which those chapters had been excised, the page numbering skipping like a broken memory. What lingers now are the objects that refuse to be erased. A finial in a forgotten Krasnoyarsk warehouse, its alloy still bearing a spectrographic signature that no academic journal will explain. A slate jar in a Tomsk museum, its porcelain isolator intact, labeled with a question mark someone penciled in a century ago. And the spires themselves, still pointing toward the charged layers of the atmosphere, disconnected from their underground grids, waiting for someone to reverse the logic of the enclosure that silenced them. They are not monuments, they are dormant infrastructure, and the planet's electric field has never stopped offering what they were built to receive. I have held one of these fragments. In the storage basement of a regional museum in Krasnoyarsk, a curator handed me a finial removed from a demolished municipal building in 1904, catalogued simply as roof ornament, brass. It was not brass. It was an alloy of copper, zinc, and trace antimony in proportions that resist oxidation far more effectively than any documented 19th century metallurgical formula. The interior surface, never meant to be seen, was machined with a precision spiral groove, a feature invisible in every photograph and functionally irrelevant for decoration. When I ran my thumb along that groove, the curator looked at me with an expression I have come to recognize in this line of inquiry. The look of someone who has privately suspected for years that the museum label is wrong, but lacks the institutional permission to rewrite it. She told me quietly that the object had been loaned to a university physics department in the 1970s, where a doctoral student measured its dielectric response. The results, she said, were never published. The student's advisor, she was told, considered the line of inquiry unprofessional. That word, unprofessional, is the mechanism by which entire branches of knowledge are pruned from the scientific record. The atmospheric energy hypothesis is not mechanically impossible. The potential gradient between the ionosphere and the ground averages roughly 100 volts per meter in fair weather, a vast reservoir of untapped potential that has been measured and documented for over a century. The challenge has always been impedance matching, extracting useful current from a high voltage, extremely low current source. But a tuned resonant system, a tall, precisely dimensioned conductive spire coupled to a large telluric grounding array, transforms the electrical relationship. It does not steal charge from the sky, it oscillates with it. The physics is not fringe. It is the same physics that Tesla explored at Colorado Springs, that Hermann Plassen patented in 1921, that the United States Navy briefly investigated for stratospheric energy harvesting before the project was classified in the 1950s. The difference is that the Tartarian network, if it existed, was not experimental. It was built out. It was mundane. It was already there. This raises the most uncomfortable possibility of all. If a civilization in the early 1800s had mastered a distributed, free energy infrastructure built into the very fabric of its cities, what else might it have understood? The metallurgy of the finial fragments suggests an electrochemical refinement process that leaves no slag, no tailings, no environmental fingerprint that matches any known industrial site. The subsurface telluric grids appear to have been laid using a slurry injection technique that leaves uniform mineralized channels at depths no 19th century excavation equipment could achieve, unless the equipment was not steam-powered but something else entirely. And the slate-encased jars, the most enigmatic component, bear structural similarities to modern high-energy density capacitors, yet predate the official invention of the capacitor by half a century. One of the jars, analyzed with an electron microscope in a privately funded study I was permitted to review, showed a layered internal coating of zinc, bismuth, and a carbon allotrope that does not appear in any materials science textbook. The coating had been applied in a vacuum deposition process. In 1840, the laboratory report was marked inconclusive and quietly filed. No follow-up study was ever commissioned. I have stopped asking why the evidence was buried. The answer to that question is no longer interesting to me. The question that now occupies my thoughts is simpler and far more unsettling. How much of the physical world we still walk through, the surviving spires, the disconnected grounding grids, the basement chambers converted into storage closets, remains dormant but intact, waiting for nothing more than a reconnection to reawaken? And if someone, somewhere, has already reconnected it, would we even know? Or would the grid simply hum back to life, silent and metering nothing, while the official world, trained for a century and a half not to see it, continues looking straight through it? I return to the curator's expression, that mixture of certainty and institutional silence. Somewhere in a warehouse, a finial waits. The sky remains exactly as charged as it was in September of 1859. The only thing missing is the will to ask a question that has been ruled unprofessional for over a century. I wonder whether this documentary, in its own small way, is part of that reconnection. The official story, the one printed in textbooks and taught in lecture halls, insists that free energy is a fantasy. It is a thermodynamic impossibility, a perpetual motion delusion pursued by cranks and mystics. But the official story is not describing free energy. It is describing a closed system, a machine that powers itself in isolation. The Tartarian configuration, if Petrov's diagram and the subsurface grids and the fractured slate jars are read as a coherent whole, was never a closed system. It was an open coupling to a planetary-scale dynamo, the constantly replenished potential between the electrically charged ionosphere and the conductive Earth. The energy was not created from nothing. It was harvested from a circuit that had been running for billions of years before the first finial was ever raised. The thermodynamics argument, so often deployed to dismiss this entire line of inquiry, collapses the moment you realize the system's fuel source was the sun and the Earth's own magnetic field. No laws of physics were broken, only a narrative was broken, and narratives, unlike laws, can be rewritten. I want to return to Kazan, to the building Petrov drew in 1843. That building no longer stands. It was demolished in 1872, officially to make way for a wider boulevard. The demolition crew, according to a brief municipal notice, removed several dozen slate-encased jars from the basement and sold them to a local brickmaker who crushed them for aggregate. No one recorded what the jars contained. No one photographed the internal metal lattice before it was torn from the walls and carted to a smelter. The boulevard that replaced the building is still there, lined with gas lamps that were, within a decade, converted to electric incandescents, powered by a centralized coal-fired plant. The plant is now decommissioned, its smokestack a heritage monument, and the boulevard is lit by LED fixtures powered by the regional grid. The grid is aging, stressed, burning natural gas to meet peak demand. And 50 meters beneath the pavement, the telluric grounding array that once served Petrov's building remains untouched. It is still conductive, it is still tuned, it has simply been disconnected from the sky. This is not a call to action in any conventional sense. I am not advocating that anyone climb a spire with a coil of copper wire. What I am suggesting, quietly and with full acknowledgement of the institutional resistance I am inviting, is that the history of energy is not the straight line we have been shown. It is a palimpsest, a document scraped clean and written over, and the scraping was not time or neglect. It was policy. It was an economic enclosure of the atmosphere itself, executed so thoroughly that even the memory of the enclosure was fenced off. The slate jars are not coming back. The finials will not be reconnected by any municipal authority. But the question of what they were, that question is not under anyone's jurisdiction. It lives wherever someone looks up at an old building and sees not a relic, but a diagram, a component, a possibility that hums inaudibly in the 100 volts per meter gradient that has never gone away. I think about the curator in Krasnoyarsk, the doctoral student whose results were suppressed, the stonemason in Edinburgh who wrote that he was removing copper fixtures from a building that did not need fixing. They were not radicals. They were people who noticed a discrepancy and recorded it, assuming the record would eventually be reconciled. It has not been. The reconciliation has been left to us, the ones who inherit the disconnected grids and the orphaned finials, and the word Tartaria itself, which has come to function less as a place name than as a gravestone for a technological tradition that was never meant to be remembered. I do not know if the atmosphere can ever again be tapped by a public building without permission. I only know that it was, and that the evidence was not destroyed, merely rebranded as decoration, as ritual, as anything other than what it was. What you do with that knowledge is not something a documentary can prescribe. It is something you carry, perhaps, the next time you pass a spire that seems to be reaching towards something it can no longer quite touch. The sky remembers. The earth remembers. Only the connecting wire was cut. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.